forces of 200, and I think it's more now, companies that are boycotting Russia. Now, you might say, good on them. Well, what's the problem with that? Well, that's all very well and good until they turn the guns on you.
Hi, I'm Evelyn Rae. Welcome to the Caldron Pool Show. Really excited about our guest today. We have Australian Liberal Senator from South Australia, Alex Antic. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks, Evelyn. Thanks for having me.
Now, I've been watching your journey, particularly over the last couple of years. I'm sure you've been speaking out about things for longer than that, but I think the last couple of years has forced a lot of people to be interested in politics, to be interested in what is happening in Australia. And a lot of people have gravitated towards yourself because you have been one of the few Australian politicians who feels to be on the side of the people and who seems to be speaking common sense, which is quite fleeting at the moment. Now, I wanted to sort of get your opinion on the handling of the last couple of years. I know you've been outspoken about the vaccine mandates in particular, and would love to hear from your lens what it's looked like for you.
Yeah. Well, look, thanks, Evelyn. It's very generous. I'm not sure about having how many people are that interested in what I say, but you do your best in this job, I suppose, and that's about the best you can do. And the last 2 years have probably been a pretty interesting time to come into Parliament. I was elected in the election of 2019, so July 2019, and we were sort of 6 months, if that, off this fairly tumultuous period in our history that we didn't think was coming. So I thought we'd be dealing with more routine things. I was looking forward to doing the work that a Conservative Liberal should do in trying to call for removing regulation and red tape and all the rest of it. And here we are, and it's sort of taken a different tangent. But yeah, look, a very interesting ride along the way. I don't know. I think that there are things that just aren't being said always as clearly as they should be sometimes from all sides of politics that need to be said. And the COVID period has probably for the first time in our history brought a lot of these things to the surface. Little things even like, how the federation works. I mean, that's something that's become laser-like focused in the last little period because we're dealing with border closures and we're dealing with travel and the various different power balances between the states and the federal Commonwealth government. So there's been a lot on the go, but I guess the key thing really has been this issue of the mandates for me. It sort of goes to the very heart of the reasons why I got involved in politics, really, and the party's core principles, in my view, which are individual freedom of choice, and some of these things that have touched small businesses as well tie into that. I think these sort of imposts that have been put onto small businesses have really caused me to just sort of speak up. It's not always popular, draws a lot of fire. But, as somebody once said to me, you shouldn't be in this business to ride with it. Politics ultimately is combat. So sadly, we've got to sometimes speak up and do that. And I think the vaccine mandates have been one of those very, very important issues.
Yeah, it's been quite divisive in Australia. You're seeing families divided. I personally have lost family because of my personal choice. And you're seeing a lot of children being upset with their parents for decisions that they've made. And yeah, it is quite disheartening watching the Australia that you love be so divided, particularly so close to home, within the home. And it's refreshing seeing a politician who is willing to have this conversation, because a lot of us just want to have that conversation, but it seems like objective debate is something that we're not allowed to have. And I was going to ask you, you mentioned before that, there's a lot of fire, with your position and a lot of people who disagree with what you say. What has it been like within house for you? Have you found allies close to you that have been supportive, or have you kind of had to really step out on your own here on a limb?
Oh, look, not too bad. One thing I will say is that we hear it all the time that the Liberal Party's a broad church, and I know it's a hackneyed old phrase, but it is true. And one thing you generally don't get into trouble for is having your own opinion and your own view, and sometimes even your own stance politically. And that's certainly been the case for myself, and probably for Senator Rennick from Queensland, who's probably adopted a pretty similar line. So look, pretty good. I mean, I have to say, I haven't really noticed the difference. Whether or not there's been some, and I don't know about it, might be the case, I don't know. But I think we have to remember what we're bound on, and the principles we're founded on is to be able to have that individual thought. We're not the ALP. The ALP move in a circle, move in a pack, and there are lots of people, I think, inside my party that agree, both at state and federal level, and I've spoken to many of them. Not everybody is as fortunate enough to be in the position to say that, though. I think this is very much the work of the upper house. It is harder at the lower house because of the nature of the vote, and particularly, when you're looking for 51% of the vote, I don't know if you'd get 51% of the people with you on this issue. So I think, from my point of view, there's a whole host of reasons why it's important, but it's the old adage, isn't it? If not you, then who? And if not now, when? And this is a really, really, really important issue for the country. And I think one of the things that's really struck me, perhaps even 18 months ago, was how quickly Australians kind of fell into this acceptance of authority, because I think Aussies are basically good-natured people and are trying to do the right thing. But the question remains whether or not we've thrown the baby out with the bathwater when it comes to our freedoms. And one of the things I'm really, really keen on here in South Australia is having a look at, once we can get back to normal, whether we've reclaimed all of those freedoms, because it struck me that there are emergencies utilised for clawing power back for bureaucrats and other public servant type arrangements that never get returned to the people. So that's something I really want to keep an eye on. But there's so much to cover at the moment. Everything's a moving target, I guess.
Yeah. And you've spoken pretty boldly about the medical backing for the mandates and how there basically is no medical backing at all, which would justify the mandates. Is this something you'd be happy to sort of elaborate on for us?
Oh, yeah, of course. Yeah. Look, I think it's the great intrigue about what's happened and this almost pack-like mentality that we've seen institutions and professions, entire professions, the legal profession, the medical profession, although, I know they've had their difficulties with their own regulatory body and getting whacked on the knuckles for having the temerity to say what might be good for their own clients, and patients, I should say. So putting all of that aside, it really is one of the most intriguing things we've seen, because early on when this injection, we'll call it an injection if it's a vaccine, was introduced, Pfizer, I think the makers of one of them were saying, well, this will stop transmission and it's going to stop it in its tracks. And it became clear pretty early on in the piece that it wasn't doing that. And so that caused people like myself, I think, to ask some questions. I'm sure your alarm bells were raised for you as well. And to ask questions of the medical bureaucrats, the health bureaucrats, which I did in SA, to say, well, what is the scientific, trust the science, right? We're always told to trust the science. So let's see it. What is the medical basis for mandating people? If this, medication is not stopping transmission, then really what difference does it make to customers if you're running a shop, or co-workers if you're running a professional services business? And why are all these businesses putting their own mandates on? We saw this very similar pattern in addition to the public health mandates that were put here in South Australia, of which there were a category of about 5 for nurses, teachers, police officers. We also saw the private sector following in suit, doing the same sorts of things, and nobody was ever really explaining why it was. And so that was a source of pretty extreme frustration for me, and of course, for the people that have been forced out of jobs and have had to make that terrible decision about, do they take the plunge on this medication, or do they lose their jobs? I mean, why we've been putting people into this without concrete evidence is a scandal as far as I'm concerned. And so I've asked that question. I did ask that question of SA Health here in South Australia, and we put a freedom of information application, which is really the only mechanism other than writing to, but I don't get a lot of answers when I write my letters. An FOI application, freedom of information application, to the SA Health bureaucrats, seeking pretty much everything, all of the notes, all of the recommendations, all of the copies of these incredible medical studies that show that this was a going concern, this mandate issue was worthwhile. Didn't hear anything. We triggered off the next point, the month, you've got to ask again, and didn't do anything. And eventually upscaled it to the Ombudsman, the statutory body of the Ombudsman here, and didn't hear anything. And ultimately, the Ombudsman made an order that the documents be released, and they still wouldn't produce them. So, you start to wonder, what is this all about? Eventually, those documents were produced. There were about 50 pages. They were all committee meeting minutes where they were talking about everything but mandates. I'm not even sure if the word mandate gets referred to at all in there, perhaps once, but certainly only in passing. And, you sort of shrug your shoulders and say, well, what is going on here? What is this all about? And where's the evidence? We've heard for the greater period of the last 15 years, trust the science. The climate is changing. The Earth's heating up. I know that's the case where you are there in New South Wales. I mean, it's madness. And yet, when it comes to this very serious issue, the evidence is nowhere to be seen. So I think this is a brewing issue and something we're going to hear more about.
Yeah, it's interesting. I'm not sure whether this happened and coincided at the same time, but it was only a couple of weeks ago the South Australian Police Commissioner or Minister actually dropped the mandates for police officers. Now, part of that was that unvaccinated police officers had to jump through certain hoops that vaccinated didn't have to. So there's that two-tiered system still there. But it was refreshing to see common sense prevail to some degree. But, and similarly in Queensland, we had the QFS, the Queensland Fire Service, drop their mandates. We also had the life-saving in Queensland do the same thing. And I think there are a lot of people in New South Wales and Northern Territory and Western Australia who are just kind of waiting with their fingers crossed and hoping and praying, is this going to spread? Is common sense going to prevail elsewhere? And I think you also have the question of people who have lost their employment over the last couple of years because of these mandates. I think there's something like 7,000 or more school teachers in New South Wales alone who have lost their jobs because of these mandates. And lots of Australians just want to see the science. You've mandated it. And it was actually Fauci and somebody else who's part of Pfizer in America, who at the beginning did say, if you take this vaccine, you will not catch it or transmit it. And very quickly that narrative, unwound from itself and the truth came out. But the mandate still remained. And it's just been mind-boggling for so many of us because it wouldn't even pass your basic pub test, this level of science. So can you see this changing anytime soon? Do you think that there's a bit of momentum, coming from South Australia with this inquiry? Do you think it's going to get infectious across the country and these mandates will finally be dropped?
Yeah, I certainly hope so. I mean, I saw that police commissioner one. That was actually 24 hours after they released the documents on FOI, which I don't think are related. I'm certainly not taking credit for that. I think that was probably in the works anyway for whatever reason. So I don't know. But look, I had hoped that some of it would continue and sort of that would be the spark that would continue to catch fire. It hasn't happened yet. There've been kind of anecdotal references to businesses dropping some here and there, but the real main game, I think, is are these sort of public health mandates that have been rolled out. They all seem to, I mean, certainly here in SA, they seem to come from the Emergency Management Act, which was the piece of legislation that was amended back in April of 2020, and it was amended by our Parliament to throw the gate open to having control from the bureaucrats here, and it effectively made the police commissioner the state controller, is the term under the Act. And of course, he takes advice, presumably, from others about what's right and what's wrong, what works and what doesn't. That's of course a point of interest as well. Where is it? That's what we were looking for. But really, it's sort of they're the main game. And once I think those have fallen away, if they fall away, I think a lot of the private sector will struggle to justify it. I mean, I think personally, and I'm not. This is being in the legal game is a long time ago for me now. But and so it's not advice. But I think people should keep their eye on that. I mean, ultimately. We've got in this state, a Supreme Court challenge coming up at the end of this week. I think it's the 17th or the 18th, or it might even be both. It's a 4-day trial before the Supreme Court of South Australia. It's a pretty credible, I shouldn't say pretty, it's a very credible challenge that's being run by some very, very experienced people, which is going to challenge that very notion of, was this Emergency Management Act properly utilised for this purpose? Because of course it was 2 weeks to flatten the curve, and that became 2 years to kind of bulldoze some people's livelihoods. So that's going to be really interesting, because what they're going to be asking the court to do is to make a decision about whether, and I'm paraphrasing this a bit because it's, as I say, it's been a while, but to make a decision as to whether or not, and a declaration as to whether or not the Act was properly used, and this rolling over of the declaration of a major emergency has been properly undertaken. Now, if the answer to that is it shouldn't have been used, then the mandates fall away. And potentially, I think there might be litigation that comes from that. I mean, if I was a nurse who'd been forced out of my job and I'd lost 6 months of work, I'd be pretty keen to explore that. And I would say as well that, you know, people who've been in private enterprise, and there are many that have suffered a similar fate, they should be taking advice about that as well, if it's to go that way, and we'll know more in due course. But it's a very, very interesting challenge, one of the most interesting in the country. And if it's upheld, and the court will make findings about things like transmission, and will take evidence from experts. Professor Nikolai Petrovsky, I understand, is going to be giving evidence in support of the plaintiffs, and it'll be very interesting. By the way, he was the expert, as I understand it, in the New Zealand High Court matter, which was just found a completely different set of legal facts and circumstances, but his evidence has been accepted by a superior court. So we will see. And we'll see what comes of it. But I think that's going to be a very interesting little join in the fork in the road on this whole debate. And, you know, let's see how it goes.
Yeah, I've often advised people who have children, like parents who have kids at the end of high school age, tell them to become a lawyer, because I feel like moving forward, they're never going to be out of work. I feel like these particular avenues are certainly something, as you said, that should be explored, should be looked at, because many people feel like it's been hasn't been justifiable with the sort of actions that have been taken. I think the emergency powers have been quite terrifying. And what's more terrifying is they've been around for a long time. Like, a lot of our public health acts and a lot of our emergency powers were enacted into Parliament like a very long time ago. So these sort of extreme powers and capabilities of this legislation have been around for sometimes decades. And what's terrifying, I think, for a lot of people is the precedent that has been set during this particular pandemic, and what that could potentially look like in the future. You know, is it so far of a stretch to think that climate change lockdowns might not be possible? Or, you know, we've got this mosquito virus that's now entered Australia. Is this going to be another thing? And I think that it's quite fair to think that people are scared that this could possibly happen again. So I am very hopeful and prayerful in these legal battles that are sort of coming forward, and I hope it bears good fruit. And I think I can speak on a lot of Australians in that that's where a lot of our hope sort of lays. And separate to that, I think we feel a little bit helpless. Like, what can we do? Like, what is it that we can actually do to try to make sure this doesn't happen again? Do you have any advice for Australians in terms of that?
Yeah, I think there's probably two things. I mean, the first one is, of course, they have to let their MPs know. I mean, I think the number of people that are being active is really, really good. But there are more. I think there are more people that just don't think about that. I probably wouldn't have prior to getting involved in this business as well. It's just something people don't think. So it's really important they tell their state and federal MPs all about that. But one of the things I think that's really missing from this whole scheme is the longer term focus, and that is we you know, as a collective, I suppose, as a sort of, you know, conservative you know, type of person, need to be re-involved in all of the processes. We need to be re-involved in the political process. We need to be re-involved in all facets of life, because the left have been on a long march through the institutions for decades and decades, and they now populate the field. They populate the field in terms of universities and university boards, school boards, you know, professional bodies, the AMA, and, you know, potentially even the law societies. And that voice has grown to a point where it gives them an enormous voice. And I personally think that the numbers, and people will be staggered to learn how few how small the numbers are in major political parties like mine. The ability to get involved in politics, to join a party and to get involved, really lends weight to trying to pre-select candidates that share your values. I mean, many people, I think, and we saw this through the abortion to birth bill here in South Australia, spent hours and hours out writing to their MPs and emailing them, ringing them, going and meeting with them, and then ultimately marching on the streets. And of course, I think many had probably, on both sides of politics, had probably made their mind up from the start. What we need is people who share our Judeo-Christian values in the parliament. And you do that by either becoming that person, which is terrific, or by joining a party and supporting someone who does want to do that. And the numbers are slight. We're talking several thousand. I think the party here in South Australia has 5,000 members. Now, we had that many at the Walk for Life. The fact that we're still pushing against the tide in that sense is an indictment. We need to be involved, and we need to make sure that when these things come up, we've got people that say, hang on a minute, this Emergency Management Act variation, the COVID Management Act variation bill, is that going to give too much power to the bureaucracy? We need people. I'm not saying there aren't people there already that do that, but we need people that push back in the opposite direction. And if you want to see an example of where that's worked really well, Hungary and Poland are two such countries that have done exactly that have reformed politics and are pushing back in the opposite direction in the name of righteousness, in the name of our Judeo-Christian values. So these are really, really important things, and they're things that people need to really take into account. And to get involved and to show your message that way, as well as, of course, all the things we've been doing, which is telling members of parliament how you feel.
Yeah, I think now more than ever, we have to take an interest in politics. I think Australia, by its culture, is quite, she'll be right, mate, and just get on with it. If it doesn't affect me, I don't want to think about it. Like we're hard workers. We just like to get out and work, go home, be with our families. But I think now we actually have to get off that fence, and we have to actually be looking over the fence, looking what's happening, especially what bills are going to be enacted through Parliament. I was talking to George Christensen a couple of weeks ago, and he was saying that lots of legislation that's coming through would surprise people where it's actually coming from. It's not things that the people have said that they wanted or they need. It's these big organizations and bureaucrats and things that are pushing things through, obviously because it gives them an advantage as opposed to the Australian people. So I think we need to be paying attention, and we need to be getting involved, just everyday people, so that we can be sure that things aren't going to be enacted into Parliament that are going to be pretty scary for the future, especially for the future of our kids. Now, I wanted to mention sort of the pushback in Australia. There's been a lot of people as part of these anti-mandate freedom rallies across the country in all different states, in Sydney and in Melbourne and Brisbane and, you name it, all the major cities sort of across the country. And there was a really big one, obviously, in Canberra a month or so ago, and a lot of confusion around what sort of happened there. A lot of people were saying that they've got injuries from being there, like sunburn sort of conditions, headaches, nausea, nosebleeds. And there were some interesting photographs that were taken from that day, which looked like the police down there were deploying some kind of weapon or some kind of deterrent, some kind of defense tactic, as they would probably label it, around the crowds. And a lot of people had a lot of questions. There were a lot of, I guess, guesses, what it could be, educated guesses. But all of us were kind of going, we just want to know, what was it that the AFP, what was it that the police down in Canberra were actually deploying? And I've worked in the police for 12 years. I know that we have certain capabilities. I've seen it with my own eyes. I've never seen it, though, used in this context. And in this context, I mean in peaceful contexts with families and children. I've only ever seen it being used in different circumstances. Now, yourself and I believe Senator Malcolm Roberts raised this question because many Australians just wanted to know what actually was it, and was it justifiable to use in this circumstance? So I'd love to hear whereabouts that is. You put an inquiry and they said that they would get back to you. I understand you might not have all the answers, but I'd love to sort of hear where you're at with it all.
Yeah, it was a really, I suppose, interesting period there. That was Senate estimates, I think, a month ago or thereabouts. It was only a few days, if not a week, after the convoy happened in Canberra. And of course, there were probably two things that stood out about the convoy, or maybe even three. One of them is the fact that these freedom rallies all over the country have been, I think, actually the very essence of Australia. They are unified, they are peaceful almost exclusively, and they are populated with people who represent Australia, genuine Australian people who are there to protest, and it's their right to do that. And so that was very telling. Flags of every country, you'd see Greek, Croatian, Italian, you name it, they were there, including the Australian flag. And it struck me that it was quite a spectacle. When we saw those in November, all, as you said, all over the country, these freedom rallies that were really, I think, almost universally spectacular, frankly. I just think they were great examples of what we are, and a great window into, the soul of the country. So, and I know, you spoke at one as well when, you saw it with your own eyes. I mean, those numbers were not insignificant. And even here in South Australia, we had one, I think October or so, just before November, the biggest one here, which would have, I'm just guessing, everyone guesses on crowd numbers, but if it was 25 to 30,000 people, it must be about right. The local, I was going to use another term, but let's call it a newspaper, the Adelaide Advertiser, of course, wrote it up as being, several hundred people, most of whom were troublemakers, and all this sort of nonsense. And so it was a point of extreme frustration for me that this wasn't getting reported properly. It's not a unique phenomenon, by the way, the mainstream media, missing the point or deliberately, whatever it may be. But in this case, this was particularly frustrating because, I saw it with my own eyes. I spoke at one of them as well. And good people who are worried about their future, teachers, police officers, doctors, lawyers, everyone, with maybe one ratbag in the entire crowd. So that translated into the Canberra experience, and the Canberra experience was even greater. I mean, I didn't get there because, I had to be back here in Adelaide, but I saw it, as you probably saw it, and it was extraordinary, huge numbers. So we put that to the police commissioner, and he, I think reported or repeated the number that was going around, 10,000. Now there was no. I mean, there was just no way there were 10,000. But I'm not saying he's making it up or he's lying, or whatever. That was the number that was being bandied around in the press. Goes to show how powerful it is because it gets repeated. So we put that question on notice after the event, where we write to them after the estimates hearings have. So that's the first thing I want to know, because he did say that they were extremely peaceful, which was good to get on the record, and also that it was the biggest crowd in Canberra, biggest protest in Canberra since the 80s. Now, you would think, and we've had some, by the way, we've had that one with the farmers where the doors were getting beaten in, and they make the news. This one didn't seem to. Why? That's the first question. The second thing is they were peaceful. We knew that. Now, in one sense, I don't think there's too much of a problem with police preparing. I mean, you would know more about this than I would, preparing for the worst. They're allowed to do that, of course. I mean, that's
contingency plans.
Contingencies, right? So I don't necessarily have a problem with these tactics, but people were sending around photos on the day before and the day of and a few days after of these strange boxes that were sort of like this square, which, I don't know much about it, but I'd sort of recognize as being this sort of, anti, group, what do you call it, crowd control type device called an LRAD, a long-range acoustic device. So I was intrigued by it. There were about 6 of them just in the vicinity of Parliament House. A couple on the roof and a couple on the sides and some down the front doors. And so we asked that question. So Senator Roberts did as well. He asked that, and the police commissioner said, look, I'd like to take it on notice. Fair enough. I don't, And so I pulled out the photo and said, this is the one we're talking about. And I better take that on notice, which is completely understandable. I get it. Yeah. The thing that really bothered me, though, was that I did, and I'm sure you heard them as well, and I saw them on social media as well. There were a more than insignificant number of reports of injuries, of sort of, some severe, some less severe, but, similar comments in the hundreds on the same day of people experiencing those symptoms. You said dizziness, nausea, blistering. Now, I don't know. We asked whether they were used, those machines. They said, look, they were only used in their loudspeaker format because they're designed to project a beam of sound, which apparently when it's turned on is, dispersed as a crowd or whatever. Yeah. They said they weren't used for that format, but the amount of anecdotal comments about injuries was extreme. I mean, really enough to make you wonder. So we've asked that question as well. Was something else used? We also asked about the interruptions in streaming, because I was watching live and the streaming was breaking up. Now, I suppose that could be a product of bandwidth and too much, on the whatever, maybe, I don't know. But there were a whole heap of really interesting little things that happened on the day that do require further investigation. We have asked those on notice. We've asked what was used, where it was used, whether there was something else used, whether there was an active denial style, type of defensive weapon used, or whatever it will be. But certainly it's interesting, and I think people do have a right to know about that. I think it was an unfortunate look, if nothing else. And so we'll wait to see what the answers are. We haven't got them yet. They're not required to produce them yet, I should say.
Okay, that's sort of what I was going to ask you, but that answers my question. I think it was Pauline Hanson as well, actually, from One Nation, had a lot of trouble with her phone on the day. And she actually did a big post about it, asking a lot of questions. And yeah, there are a lot of people who do have a lot of questions about that day. So I'm looking forward to getting your update once those questions are answered.
Yeah.
And I think there is a need for transparency right now. There is a fracture in relationship, I think, between Australian government, police and civilians and things. So I think having transparency is probably the only way that, or I'm not even sure if that's going to cut it at the moment, but it's certainly a step in the direction for reconciliation and I guess bridging that gap back a little bit again. But speaking about, I guess, trust and mistrust and the government and overreach and things, something which you speak about and you want to bring up, and you were on, I think, with Corey Bernardi the other night, you spoke about digital identity. And a lot of Australians who maybe haven't been interested in politics until now might not really understand what that means. Could you kind of give it to us, like digital identity for dummies, or for people like me who is sort of new into that spectrum, who would love to sort of hear what it actually is and what it would actually mean for everyday Australians? Yeah,
look, it's a really big topic, this one, and it's probably something that's going to be discussed a lot in the coming weeks and months. And look, when it comes to a basic description of it, I'm your man, because that's about all I can give. It's all a bit above my head as well, so I say. But it is essentially, the concept is that that if this, and there is a bill which is in consultation phases at the moment, it's out for discussion, I suppose they call it an exposure draft. The concept of the legislation, though, is to provide a framework whereby there is a digital identification for every person, every Australian, I think every adult, perhaps children as well at some point. But the concept is that you tie everything back to that. So your government services get allocated to that, your online presence gets tied back to that. It would potentially hold data about your spending habits and your medical habits and your perhaps even religion, all compiled into a central database, which is managed and controlled by the government. Now, there would be those that would say, well, we get monitored all the time by big tech companies, Google and others. What's the problem with that? Well, I mean, I've got some serious reservations about this, mainly because there are multiple reasons. People, I don't believe, should be surveilled. I'm worried about what it looks like in years to come. I mean, sometimes these projects start with the most virtuous means, which then ultimately, become Frankenstein's monster and turn into something else. But we've got to be very cautious of that. The second thing is collating data like that and making people, I guess, that transparent in terms of their own data means that it's there to be stolen. So we know that we've seen QR codes, for example, which we were told in many states would be destroyed after a short period of time, have been held. In some instances, I understand, have been used for other purposes like criminal investigations, and have been lost and hacked in some instances. So this is the problem with government bureaucracies getting hold of your data is, even if 99 out of the 100 people in that department have honest means, it only takes one to not have that for it to go awry. And of course, there's the other issue of where else does it go? Is it being sold off to companies to, create a public profile about you and your spending habits? I mean, we see that all the time with big tech. I would say, though, probably the biggest elephant in the room when it comes to this particular setup, though, is this concept of the social credit system. And I think that's the one that really breaks this one in half, even if it's not the current issue, whether it develops into that. And you touched on it earlier on. I've touched on it before as well and been widely pilloried here in the local press for having the temerity to suggest that this might be used a different way. We have been conditioned in the last 2 years to get used to this kind of tracking, QR codes and, quite invasive, means in terms of our lives over the last little period. And as you say, what's the next emergency? Is it a climate emergency? Do you end up with an app like there is in other countries which tracks everything you do using this digital ID, which tracks how much you buy at the supermarket? You've had one steak for the week, you can't have two because we're in a climate emergency. You've already filled your car up with petrol for the week, you can't fill it up again because we're in a climate emergency. So, people might laugh at that right now. But let's be clear, I think this is well and truly in play if we go down this path. And I'm really concerned about it. I have to say, I think that this social credit system, by the way, it's being used in China at the moment. WeChat and other type systems already do all of this, of course, tracking people's, even traffic infringements or, whether or not they hold a door open and, using this sort of facial recognition technology tied to everything else. It's already there if people need a sort of a dystopian reminder of where it could go. And just to make it even more overt, we're already doing it here in South Australia. We've got the home quarantine app, which was developed by the libertarians at use that very, very ironically at SA Health, who have decided that there is an opportunity to, instead of making people quarantine in a medi hotel, to give them the opportunity, the privilege of coming home to their own home, but only in the event of using a phone which takes a photo, it sort of contacts you, takes a photo of you 3 times a day. And if you don't, it sort of correlates your facial recognition data with your GPS location. If it doesn't marry up, then you get a knock on the door from the police. Now, if you were a criminal in this state and you had a home detention bracelet, you wouldn't get that kind of scrutiny from the authorities. So what is this all about? Now, that may well be very innocent and not tied in, but the point is that this system, the infancies of this system are building around us. And as you say earlier, Australians have a very admirable quality of she'll be right, but people have got to be aware of what's going on here. They need to understand where their future lies and what it looks like in terms of surveillance. And people need to be very clear about whether they're happy with that. I'm not. I don't like it at all. So I've got some things to say about some of that work that's being done, and I'm interested to hear from other people as well as to their views. And we'll probably be doing some survey work on that. But people can certainly contact my office by email if they like, and give me their views as well, because I'm concerned.
Yeah, I'm certainly concerned as well. I remember doing an article for Caldron Report a little while ago about this new bill that was being enacted, which would enable an authorised officer, which was a police officer or someone else part of this criminal investigation sort of branch, to hack into your social media accounts or your online data, pose as you, delete, remove and things. And it comes up originally as something that sounds like a really good cause. And coming from as a detective in the police, I think about that. I'm like, wow, I worked in the child sex crimes of Australia. That would have been really helpful for some of those pedophile rings that I was investigating and some of those child molesters that are online. And you have these thoughts of that could be used for good. But unfortunately, I think what we have to recognize is that we're dealing with big government and that they take a lot easier from the people than they ever give back. And the governments, if you look at history throughout the world, governments have a tendency to grow. They never get smaller, they only get bigger. And by giving legislation, while it might come across as a good thing, is actually pretty scary precedent to set. And we'd be pretty naive to think that it's not possible that the government could eventuate. I mean, look, as you said, China with this social credit system. What worries me about this digital identity in Australia is where it could go. Is this going to set up a two-tiered society? Those of us who aren't willing to comply with our digital identity and those who are, and how is that going to be enforced? Because people like you and me who don't want the government tracking us and having facial recognition and knowing what we're doing, what we're eating, how many hours we sleep a day, all of these things. I really I'm actually terrified where it could go, but I think that we need to be super mindful that history repeats itself. And, I certainly don't want it, and I'm not a criminal and I don't want it. I'm an everyday Australian who doesn't want this social credit system. But what if I say I don't want to do it? Does that mean I'm going to end up in jail? Does that mean I'm not going to be able to access medical support when I need it? Are my kids not going to be able to go to school because I won't put them on the digital identity? And you can sort of see the fracture that it could cause in society with this two-tiered thing. It's super scary. I hope people do reach out to you if they do have any questions about it. It's something we need to talk about. It's certainly something we need to raise awareness from. Is there really any stopping it from happening? Like, are we sort of up against like an impossible feat, or do you still see that there's redeemable qualities and we can kind of get on top of it?
Well, I think there always are, as long as politics can push back. I mean, and that's historically been the case. I guess the thing that's different in 2022 than was perhaps 20 years ago, though, is this era of globalization. And, that is something that requires extreme political will to push back on. We see, just the other week, the forces of 200, and I think it's more now, companies that are boycotting Russia. Now you might say, good on them. Well, what's the problem with that? Well, that's all very well and good until they turn the guns on you, or Australia, as the case may be. And so one of the issues I think is to what extent are we as a country being, having our feet held to the fire by forces that transcend our own government? And I think that's the most frightening thing of all. That is, are we collectively, sort of made pariahs of the international community by not adopting systems like this? And that is a frightening prospect, because I totally agree. I mean, these things often sound very inane, very banal, and what's the problem? I mean, you're not doing anything wrong, so what's the problem? You often hear that, don't you? It's like, I don't have a problem with, this, that, or the other, because I'm not doing anything wrong. But, that's all well and good until the rules change on you and you're being monitored for something that wasn't wrong at the time, but now is, and this mechanism is there to follow you. In fact, it was George Christensen who actually probably alerted me to this sort of scenario. And George will be a tremendous loss to the Parliament, and tremendous loss to people like myself as well, because he was very often a sort of a shining light on these issues. He actually coined the phrase, in something I was at, this naughty or nice register. And he was talking about vaccine passports at that stage. And it really alerted my mind to what was being spoken about here, in talking about this concept about a two-tiered society of, some getting privileges that others didn't. We saw the most egregious versions of that floating around in, when WA, and certainly in the Northern Territory not that long ago as well, where there were restrictions put on people from leaving their homes if they, you had certain privileges if you'd had the injection, and certain if you didn't. Now, I mean, I just, once again, no science on that, but the ability to be able to monitor people through that shift in public discourse, that's the thing that's frightening. And being able to have this framework there that can monitor you means that the rules can change around you. And, it might be that you think, well, it can monitor me for not committing a terrible crime, but what's tomorrow's not very terrible crime? Refusing a medical treatment? And that's today's terrible crime, in a sense. So look, I am very concerned about that. I think, once again, though, the most important thing people can do is be involved in the political process, because ultimately we are not a weak nation. We are a very strong nation. We punch above our weight. And countries around the world have shown that if you can push back against these powers, President Trump did it for years on end. He fought against these forces and won. We're not the United States. We don't have that sort of muscle, but we've got some power, and we need to be doing that and pushing back against these influences that are trying to jump the fence on us.
It's interesting you brought up the whole Russian sort of Ukraine situation and how we're boycotting Russian products. You see videos going around the internet where people are pouring out vodka, where I think it was Coles, changed the name of their chicken Kiev. And just, to be honest, it's virtue signaling. If we're going to call a spade, it's virtue signaling. It really doesn't achieve much. And if we're going to go down that road, well, why are we not boycotting China? I mean,
exactly.
But seriously, because they like back in March, April 2020, when our Australian government didn't really know what they were dealing with, they asked certain questions, and I think it was the one of the embassy members for China down in Canberra basically gave like an ultimatum: if you're not going to question us, or we're going to change wine and wheat and red meat sales. And that was sort of like a threat. So why is it that we're choosing to virtue signal for one thing and not the other? I mean, if we're going to really go that far, then the shelves that hold the vodka need to be taken down and put in the skip bin, because that's the reality of virtue signaling. And I guess that's relativism and subjectivism in a nutshell. It's just whatever you feel and the emotion at the particular time, but it lacks objective truth and reality. And I actually wanted to touch on sort of towards the end here about Ukraine and Russia, because you posted on your social media a video by Tucker Carlson, and you were sort of going through everything that we're not being told in Australia about the situation over there. And it's interesting because I would say I'm in an unpopular position with my thoughts on that whole situation. But sadly, again, me just talking about context, or me just talking about the whole picture and not picking a side. I'm on the side of humanity. I think you'd have to be a psychopath to want any innocent lives being lost. And that's the side I'm on. I'm on the side of humanity. I'm on the side of I don't want innocent people being caught in the crossfire of any war. But unfortunately, just having conversations about things that we might not be privy to is off limits, it seems. And it appears that the mainstream media are peddling a narrative again. And so I'd love to get your thoughts about the situation in there and sort of what led you to share that Tucker Carlson post.
Well, I think there's a whole heap of stuff that we could spend hours talking about there, because it's such a fascinating topic. Actually, the first one that just jumps to mind is this sort of demonization that you get mainly from the political left, who love to call names in order to try to squeeze the narrative in their own direction. If you call people anti-vax simply because they're pro-choice about matter, then that'll scare them off and they'll do what we want. You can see that developing now a little bit with the Ukraine situation. And what do they say? Last week's anti-vax is today's pro-Putin. Well, I don't know anyone that's particularly pro-Putin. I don't consider myself pro-Putin. I don't have any warm feelings towards his authoritarian regime or that of China or any of the above. But what I do like, a bit like you, is the truth. And also the humanitarian side of it. I mean, it's heartbreaking to see all of this going on. It's very reminiscent in many ways of what happened in the in some ways in the Balkans in the early 90s, which was the part of the world that my distant family were from. So to see this sort of play, I mean, we didn't have too much of a connection there, but to see it playing out again in real time is awful and terrible. But I think what we're seeing now out in the community is this distrust of what they're seeing. I don't think communities, feeling for or trust in the media has ever been lower because of what we've been through over the last 2 years and beyond. I mean, it's always been there, but that's the real message for me. And so to see people like Tucker Carlson taking it on and telling some of the truth about what's happening, that there's not always a bad guy and a good guy. Sometimes there are two bad guys. Sometimes there's a good guy and a slightly better guy. Sometimes there's a bad guy and a slightly worse guy. We don't know. But the truth is here that the story is not always being told. And, like you, I find a great degree of frustration in what you could also call gesture politics, people tipping out vodka. And, I had a friend once who was a comedian, and he said there's no point in being vegetarian at a restaurant because the chicken's already dead. Like, you've already killed it. So it's too late for that one, right? Well, it's a bit like that here. I mean, tipping out vodka is not hurting the Putin regime, I can assure you. All it's doing is making your Facebook feed look more woke. And Elon Musk summed it up pretty nicely on Twitter yesterday, where he put up a sort of a badge saying I'm for the current thing,
supporting the current thing. Yes,
I'm supporting the current thing, and it's a bit like that. We saw the beginnings of this in 2012, I think it was, with the sort of fad that was chasing down Joseph Kony, the terrible African warlord, and everybody had it up on their early days of their Facebook, and nothing happened. Of course, Kony's still alive and well, and presumably, and doing all the terrible things he did before. People love an easy way of doing it. It's called Slacktivism. And it's no use to anyone, particularly when you're ill-informed. And frankly, we're all a bit ill-informed at the moment because we don't know where to get the truth from. So that's the frustration for me. But the exception to the rule, I think, is Tucker's show. I think he does a terrific job in terms of getting to the core of what's actually happening, speaking without fear and favour, and presumably getting called every name under the sun for simply having the guts to actually say it. I mean, a great example of that was that episode of Q&A, which apparently is still on. Nobody seems to be watching it. I'm certainly not watching it. I think 6.5 people and their mother were watching it the other week. But those who were saw this kid get kicked out for asking a question about Russia. Well, I can't wait till Senate estimates. I've got a whole heap of questions about that coming up, because if that's the best our national broadcaster can do, then we have even more questions to ask about whether or not we're still getting value for money.
Yeah, and it's interesting because the Q&A, that particular question that gentleman had to ask, was vetted prior to him being in the audience. And so it does seem like there is a really unfair bias in our media. I think that political activism has turned into the day job of journalist. And I think the two worlds have crossed over to the point where the line between political activism and journalism has blurred so much you can't tell them apart. Yeah. And I guess it's a reflection on our culture. It's a reflection on where we are. And unfortunately, at the moment, emotion is defining fact and intention is defining morality. And that's just not a sustainable way for any nation to flourish. And we have had a pretty successful nation in Australia and around the world in the West, because we have essentially built our pillars on morality and truth and fact and not fiction. So I think we have to really turn it around, or we're going to keep seeing the West implode, unfortunately, because stupidity can't sustain itself and it will eventually collapse. So I think the media, like you said, have a lot to answer for, and especially the corporations, the bureaucrats and the government, who are sort of facilitating and egging on the media to do what they're sort of doing. But look, I absolutely have loved having you on. I've loved hearing everything that you've had to say, and I guarantee you most Australians are definitely cheering you on and want to see you still making a difference in our parliament. And I'm sure a lot of South Australians are grateful, and I'm jealous that you're not in New South Wales. I'd love to have, more people like you who are in a position to actually make positive change for our country. But look, where can people follow you? Where can people find you?
Well, thanks for all of that. It's very generous. I don't know about any of the bona fides of any of that, but I just do. It's sometimes being a loudmouth who has no ability to shut that mouth is a virtue. So we'll keep trying with that and see how it goes. Look, I'm probably at this stage, sadly, Facebook Senator Alex Antic on Facebook is probably the most one, but I do run a Getter account as well, in the very real expectation of getting cancelled at some point with one of our big tech overlords. And of course, I look forward to Truth Social, which will be the Trump platform, which I'm intending to jump on board as well, in the hope that will provide a credible alternative. We do have a YouTube and a Rumble page, but mainly the social media is the place for it. So we'll keep plugging along there until we overstep an invisible line on Facebook and we get cancelled. So see how we go.
Oh, well, thanks again for joining me today. I really appreciate you, and and look forward to hearing about all these inquiries and court matters that are coming up. So hoping and praying for good outcomes.
Thanks, Evelyn. Thanks for having me, and keep up the great work. I'll be watching too.